Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Goff, the president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And welcome back to those of you who were with us yesterday afternoon, and welcome to those who are just joining us this morning. We have registrants from all over the United States and approximately 140 people who signed up for this conference, and we thank you very much. As many of you know, this is our first collaborative effort with the Texas Jewish Historical Society, and we certainly hope that this is the first of several more to come in the near future. In yesterday's program, the Galveston Movement story came to light as part of a little-known period of time in American Jewish history that had a major impact on the social, cultural, and economic development in history, not only in Texas, New Mexico, but throughout the Midwest. Through the film, West of Hester Street, our speakers and panel speakers helped us learn more about Hester Street, what that meant in American Jewish history, and the decision among several prominent Jews in America to open up another port of entry for Jewish immigrants coming from Central and Eastern Europe. The making of the film, behind the scenes, with Alan and Cynthia Salzman-Mondel, the producers and directors, gave us a wonderful glimpse behind the scenes of the making of that film and the extensive research that they undertook for several years in putting this film together, and as well as the casting and the different challenges that they faced to make this wonderful movie. Following that, yesterday, we had a terrific panel discussion called The Descendants of the Galveston Movement, whose grandparents came through Galveston, and we heard personal stories from descendants of those individuals and who comprise a very tightly knit extended through 3 generations. Our last session yesterday highlighted the Klein family of Las Cruces, New Mexico, who were pillars of the community in Las Cruces for many, many years, and were very much behind the business, social, and civic community of Las Cruces for many, many years. Today, with Bryan Stone, the story continues following the footsteps of those who stepped off the ships from which they came, Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where they ultimately landed and the challenges that they faced. We're also going to hear from Naomi Sandweiss, a member of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society and one of our past presidents, who will talk about 2 brothers, the Meyers Brothers, who successfully established themselves in Amarillo, Texas, as well as in Albuquerque. And our final speaker of the day will be Haidee Joy, who will take us further south to Mexico and share the fascinating story of the arrival of Jews in Mexico and their influence over several hundred years up to the current day. Let me also remind people that we do have a breakout session, one breakout session following the program. And I have to say, again, some shout out thanks to some very key people who made all of this possible. On the part of our Texas colleagues, Susan Zach Lewis, who is the immediate past president of the Society, Sheldon Littman, the current president, Sally Dreher, and Vicki Vogel. Our planning group from the New Mexico contingent is Betty Evans, Harvey Buckhalter, Jeff Brown, and Joy Rosenberg. And a huge double thanks to Ron Duncan Hart from New Mexico here in Santa Fe for being our tech guru. We couldn't do this without you, Ron. and Marcia Torobin, who's been the backup guru, and Claudia Bloom, our administrator. And finally, let me thank the donors to our fall conference from New Mexico Jewish Historical Society and those who have contributed to our endowment, which makes all of this possible. And for that, we thank you very much. So let me turn it over to my partner in crime, Sheldon Lippman.
Thank you again, Linda, and members of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society for inviting the TJHS to join you in presenting this webinar. I said yesterday that our two organizations have so much to learn from each other by sharing our family stories. I hope this is a trend that will continue. Yesterday's sessions made me think about the many immigrant stories that affect Jews all across our states, nation, and the world, and the serendipity or the chance of boarding a ship to a strange land and hoping for a good outcome. I'm reminded of how many of my relatives in Lithuania boarded a ship to America, not realizing there was a North and South America. And today I have relatives in Uruguay. I was told a story by a young docent at the Jewish Museum in Dublin, and a shout out to Jan Hart, that's Dublin, Ireland, not Dublin, Texas. Jewish Eastern Europeans boarded a ship for New York. Most of these immigrants did not speak English and were told that when the ship stops and they heard New York, get off. Before the ocean crossing voyage, the ship made a stop in Cork, Ireland. The passengers thought they heard York and got off the ship. That is why there's a large Jewish population in Cork, Ireland. I love hearing family stories and family histories. And if you feel the same, then we have all been at the right place this weekend. Enjoy day 2 of the webinar.
Thank you, Sheldon, very much. I'd like to turn the beginning program over to Sally Dreher from the Texas Jewish Historical Society, who will introduce our first program session. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Linda. Our first speaker for the day is my friend Bryan Stone. Bryan is a native Texan. Both of his parents and 3 of his grandparents and several of his great-grandparents were Texans. Actually, his great-grandfather, Edgar Goldberg, founded, for those of you in Houston and the surrounding area, the Houston Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Herald Voice. Bryan is a professor of history at Del Mar College in Corpus Christi, Texas, where he teaches courses in U.S. history, and he's been a visiting professor at the Schusterman Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. He is editor of Alexander Z. Gurowitz's historical memoir, Memories of Two Generations, A Yiddish Life in Russia and Texas. As an aside, yesterday in the breakout session, I asked Rachel how she came to this conference, and it was via reading this book of Bryan's about Alexander Gurewitz. Bryan is also wrote this book. I hope you can all see it. It's called The Chosen Folks, Jews on the Frontiers of Texas, which won the Southern Jewish Historical Society's book prize in 2011. He is also the managing editor of the annual Journal of Southern Jewish History. He is currently researching the Galveston immigration movement from 1907 to 1914, with a focus on the immigrants' communities it brought together. He holds a PhD in American Studies and Civilization from the University of Texas at Austin. And as a side note, Bryan has joined a rarefied group of us whose child and parent are current or past board members of TJHS, as Bryan's mother, Barbara, is also a board member. And now I give you Bryan Stone and through Galveston into the Hinterland.
Thank you, Sally. That was very nice. Yeah, my mom's on the board now. Apparently she's thrilled. She's also on this call, which is interesting. but hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. This has been a wonderful event. I mean, this has just been great. Yesterday was tremendous. It's great to be able to hear these stories of individuals and of families. That's sort of where I've been trying to do some work, and it's been really rewarding to hear that. I also wanted to mention just specifically to Cynthia and Alan Mundell, I of course had seen the film before. It had been a long time, and I really appreciated the opportunity to see it again. All of us who write history, who publish history, who make films would be so lucky for our work to hold up so well for such a long time. I won't count the years for you, but the film's been around a while and it holds up remarkably well. So it was a privilege and a pleasure to watch it. And thank you for making it available. The Galveston movement for me is both a very old subject and a very new subject. I've been working on it intermittently for a long time. It was the book that Sally showed you, the history of Texas Jews. It figured it's nearly a whole chapter in that book. It was a very important part of the memoir that I edited by Alexander Gurwitz, which came out just a few years ago. Gurwitz was a Galveston immigrant, settled in San Antonio, and told his life story, which was quite an expansive life, but including the portion of his life that brought him to Texas. And it is, as far as I know, the only firsthand account of an immigrant's entire voyage, literally door to door. We left our home in Russia, said goodbye to our friends, got on the ship, and then here's what happened after. It describes the entire journey, which is an extraordinary document. So I've worked on this for some time in these earlier contexts, but more recently I had an opportunity to kind of learn some new things and begin rediscovering or discovering some new aspects of this movement. I worked on an article which was published a few years ago based on a document that I had collected a copy of when I was researching at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And I had made a copy of this thing and stuck it in a folder and forgot about it, and had the opportunity to come back later and look at it. I can actually show it to you. Let me see. I should be able to share my screen with you here. Okay, there. Pull my notes back. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm flipping around here. That's what I need. This is a collection of statistics, basically. It's numbers. It's page after page after page of tables. And this was produced in Galveston by the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau in early 1914. The movement had not quite completed yet, so it doesn't include the last few months. But it's basically statistical data on who came, where they were sent, demographic data about the immigrants themselves, male, female, age, all of the trades and occupations that they were identified as pursuing. This was such a wealth of information, not about individuals, unfortunately, it doesn't name anyone, but sort of aggregate information about who we're talking about here. Because in most of the other material that was available, the historical documentation, there was a lot of talk of the immigrants, you know, it just sort of as one collective group. And this started helping me sort of imagine them as people and as individuals. It got me sort of thinking about the Galveston movement in a few, I think, sort of different ways. It was not, as tempting as it is to see it this way, the Galveston movement was not ultimately about Jacob Schiff. It wasn't even about Rabbi Cohen. It was about the immigrants, and it was about their experiences and their life stories and how being involved in this effort changed them, set them on a different path. And that is a story, or those are stories, that have really not been collected as widely and thoroughly as I think they should. We know a lot more about Schiff and Cohen than we do about the people they were helping. It also, I think, the statistics that I studied reminded me, or at least sort of emphasized for me, that this was not primarily, as it was marketed, a job placement program. That is, it wasn't entirely about matching working men with jobs. They were the largest group. The average immigrant, if we could imagine that, was 31 years old, male, of course, The most common trades were tailors, shoemakers, clerks, jobs that would be very common and easy to fill. But they were not the whole group. When you look at the statistics, it becomes clear about a third of the placements were women and children. 22% were women, 15% were children under 15. That is, to a great extent, this was a family service. This was about migrating entire families from Russia to somewhere in America. And it was about reuniting those families. Very often they bring the father or the husband first, and then facilitate later the reunion with his wife and children. This happened quite frequently. So this was an aspect of it that I think is very important, and again, sort of often overlooked. And then finally, and this is an observation that may break a few hearts, it sort of broke mine, but I think it's important to point out, the Galveston movement was not a Texas phenomenon. We think of it as very much part of our Texas Jewish history, and of course, it happened here, right? Galveston is in Texas, this is true. But Galveston was a port of entry. Texas was a port of entry. As we've already seen a number of examples of, the whole point was to move them through as quickly as possible and place them somewhere else. If we can look at a map, this shows us, I'm sorry, I'm looking at two windows here. Here we go. This shows us, this is based on the statistical tables that I had a copy of. It shows us the ultimate destination, or rather the settlement destinations, where each of these immigrants was sent. There are 236 pins on this map in 32 states, demonstrating really a very broad dispersal of the immigrants. This, of course, was the point. They were supposed to be broadly dispersed. They were supposed to go to as many places as possible. Only 16 states at that time received no immigrants. So this was very much a national program. Now, Texas did get more than anyone else. 25% roughly of the total went to somewhere in Texas. But as this map reminds us, these are 12 locations that received the greatest number. So the cities that received, in this case, more than 200 immigrants. There are a lot of Texas cities on here, which accounts for the larger number that went there. But many more went to Kansas City. Many more went to St. Paul and Minneapolis, and many other Midwestern cities especially. Texas, Houston, which got more than any other Texas city, is only the fourth largest recipient community on this list. So we have to be careful not to think about this as Texas Jewish history. This is much more so Kansas City Jewish history. It's Iowa Jewish history. Missouri and Minneapolis were Minnesota were much, at least equivalent participants in this. And it had an impact on them at least as great as it did here on Texas. And I will admit, I know nothing about that. It's partly what I hope to research. What was the impact of this on the Jews of Iowa, which apparently there were. So this is something I think worth looking into. This shows some of the data in a slightly different way, just to remind us of another point. These are 58 locations that received one immigrant each. This is also quite a dispersed settlement. There are, you can see, only 2 pins, by the way, in New Mexico. I don't know much about who those individuals were. There were little towns in southern New Mexico that I admit I don't know much about. Mesquite got 1 and La Mesa got 1. I wish I knew more about who those individuals actually were or what happened to them. But New Mexico was sort of a little bit off the path of this particular plan. In my current research, what I hope to do, and it's sort of big as I'm kind of imagining it, but I would like to treat the Galveston movement more sort of from the ground up rather than the top down, rather than who the managers were, what they did, their activities, to see it as the story of 236 towns and nearly 10,000 individual immigrants, and to try to understand the connections between those. Who went where and what effect did that have? What happened to them over time? We know sort of something about them until they got off the boat, but then what? And what happened to them through the rest of their lives? Did they stay where they were sent? Did they prosper there? Did they contribute? And if so, in what way, to the Jewish communities of these cities and towns? I'd like to know a lot more about those things. This map, returning to the first one here, showing that all of the immigrants of all the different to all the different communities, the film made the point, among many good points, that Jacob Schiff was very concerned not to send people to places where there were no Jews. He didn't want to make anybody the first Jew in a place. There had to be somebody there to meet them, to welcome them, to help provide for their needs until they could get their feet on the ground. And so in a sense, this map of recipient destinations sort of doubles as a map of Jewish communal organization. These are places where Jews were active and organized and living and somewhat stable in their living there throughout the country in the early 20th century. I think this is a map that probably would surprise some American Jewish historians, that there were so many communities and that they were organized enough to draw the attention of the Galveston Bureau. The way that the movement operated, headquartered, of course, in New York, with a sort of main activity office or active office in Galveston, they searched out locations for potential immigrants based on connections that they already had there. A lot of those connections were made through the B'nai B'rith, which of course had hundreds, if not thousands of chapters throughout the United States. In other cases, they were working with the files of the Industrial Removal Office, which was sort of the predecessor in New York of the Galveston movement. There had been an effort earlier to move Jews who already were in New York out of New York. And the IRO had already sort of established this network throughout the United States. The Galveston movement built on the same network. So we can look at this just as a sample found in the files of the Jewish Bureau in Galveston. They collected specific information, specific data about every community that they could access in the country, down to, of course, what sorts of jobs are available, what sorts of businesses are there, what sorts of Jewish facilities they have. You can see at the bottom here with Cedar Rapids that they have a synagogue and a Hebrew teacher and 50 Jewish families and other Jewish societies. They tracked this for hundreds of towns to try to have a sense of where they were sending people and to make a match, right? Match them with a job, but in addition, match them with a community, match them with someplace they may be able to remain and stay and live. This job matching service had, let's say, mixed results. It's always difficult to look at this movement objectively, in hindsight, because we want it to be a success. We want this to be this great and wonderful story. It's not that simple. There were problems. This didn't work very well. And a lot of the reasons that it didn't work well had to do with disconnects and misunderstandings between the local agents who were responsible for meeting and taking care of the immigrants and the headquarters, who were obviously responsible for sending the immigrants. They often didn't get each other. They often weren't in it for the same reason. We would perhaps like to assume that altruism was at the heart of this. This was about Jews helping Jews. It kind of wasn't. I have no doubt that was the motive of the managers of Schiff and his colleagues. But at the local level, the thing that comes through in their correspondence most clearly is that they were in it for their own sort of local needs. They had jobs that needed filling. And if they could fill those jobs with people they didn't have to pay very much, all the better. If they could get this influx of low-skilled work from Europe, great. Now, if they could, help some people too, no harm done. But that was not the primary goal for most of the local agents. And so there were frequently misunderstandings or even mistreatment or misbehavior toward the immigrants. The correspondence, when you read sort of the letters between local agents and the headquarters in Galveston, which was Morris Waldman primarily doing the corresponding, there are words that come up repeatedly and you sort of can't help but notice them. The local agents referred to consignments of immigrants, requisitions of immigrants, shipments of immigrants. These are very business-oriented people, and they were thinking very much in terms of moving widgets, to where they needed to go. And even if they did sort of successfully move a lot of widgets, I think we do have to kind of question that motive a little bit. There were frequently cancellations of agreements they had made. I think the film referred to this also, where a local committee or local community would say, we can take, 5 men and we'll place them. But then later they cancel. The economy had something to do with that, certainly, but it didn't change when the economy got better. These, as they called requisitions, were constantly being created and constantly dissolved as local conditions changed. Frequently, in addition, the immigrants themselves, I'll come back to that, sorry. The immigrants themselves left of their own will. They would be placed somewhere and then abscond. This happened far more than the organizers were happy with. They actually had a term for it. They called it drifting, that they placed somebody in a location and then he drifted, which means he decided to go somewhere else. Often the immigrants arrived in America planning to drift. That is, they saw this opportunity to get into the United States, get in with a little assistance, and then be on the first train to New York or Chicago. That was always their plan. A lot of them got to where they were going and just discovered it wasn't what they anticipated. The conditions weren't what they had hoped. And so they move on to something else. They take charge of their own lives, in a sense. This was drifting, incredibly frustrating, of course, for the managers who wanted to be able to put people in places where they knew they would be cared for and sustained. But at the same time, it demonstrates the immigrants making their own decisions. This is almost an emblem of the immigrants' autonomy and their independence. And it shows actually Americanization, right? What's more American than going where you want and pursuing your life as you wish? They began doing that at the first possible opportunity. A significant number of them did. Of course, it was a hassle for the bureaucracy. They didn't want that. It means when somebody leaves a town, they're leaving someone who had agreed to employ them, leaving them in the lurch and landing on some agent in some other community who had not agreed to employ them. So of course you wind up with 2 angry agents and an unemployed immigrant. And so this was not what the management hoped would happen, but it is what the immigrants made sure happened. The dissatisfaction and that disconnect was often, very much was a two-way street. There were reports, numerous reports from immigrants, and here too, I think the film implied this. The agents in Europe, the European end of the operation, frequently mischaracterized what the working conditions in the United States would be. They overpromised salary. They didn't describe working conditions correctly. And so often the immigrants arrived and they were terribly disappointed at the reality of their situation. That's understandable. It's also understandable that the Europeans would make this mistake. This was not deliberate deceit. I mean, this was a confusing process with multiple moving parts, and there were miscommunications. So for example, the data, like the slide I'm still showing here, the data that was collected from towns might report, for example, a cobbler or shoemaker in our town can make $12 to $15 a week. So in Russia, they tell the immigrants, you're going to make $15 a week, when in fact the immigrant's going to make $6, because the 12 to 15 is for someone with experience, who speaks the language, who knows how an American business works. And they'll get there, if they stick it out long enough, they'll get to that promised range. But that's not a starting salary. And so there were sort of misunderstandings on the other side of the ocean about how American business works and what a newly hired, unskilled worker could expect. There were disagreements, or rather misunderstandings, I think also just about what terms mean. Right? What is a shoemaker? Okay, well, we have an idea here in America that this is a cobbler. This is someone who sits at a workbench with hand tools and fabricates a shoe, from leather. What if I worked in a shoe factory? Aren't I a shoemaker? If I was the guy who dumped out the finished shoes at the end of the factory line, into a bin, I am a shoemaker. And so when they ask the immigrants, what is your trade or what is your career? And they would say, I'm a shoemaker, I'm a builder, I'm whatever, a tailor. And that means maybe he worked a machine in a garment factory. It doesn't mean he has tailoring skills. And so there too, people would arrive under a misconception of what was going to happen and what their working lives were going to be like. The immigrants often expressed this dissatisfaction. Where possible, the managers, including Morris Waldman in Galveston, would do what they could, to change conditions if they really were unfair. But frequently it was just a matter of sort of reminding the immigrants or letting them know this is how it works. And this is just sort of how it's going to be for a while. Sometimes the immigrants' responses were hard to satisfy. I mean, they were coming at this with their own concerns. Waldman described in one of his letters an immigrant he heard from who had been settled in Minneapolis, where he was working at a junk shop, earning $1.75 a day, working at this junk shop. And the man wrote to Waldman to complain and said, look, I heard from some friends who you sent to a different city that they're also making $1.75 a day and they're working in a slaughterhouse. And how come I can't have that? And Waldman says he wrote back to the guy and said, what? What are you complaining about? You're making the same pay. This is Waldman. I asked him why he was dissatisfied with the same pay at much pleasanter work than cleaning hog filth. And the guy's answer was, well, those guys, they're only working 8 hours a day and I'm working 10. It's terribly unfair, right? Well, how do you answer that? How do you explain, look, be happy, right? This is good. So Waldman had constant trouble just trying to explain circumstances to the immigrants' satisfaction. He had trouble often with agents who also, that is the local representatives and employers, who also had their own interests at heart. One of them wrote to Waldman from Milwaukee. This is the working agent, the administrative agent in Milwaukee, wrote to Waldman and said, I have tried very hard to place the two men in question, but they absolutely refuse to do the work that I want to give them. I should pause there, but they don't want to do the work that I want to give them. Right? So right away, we see maybe some miscommunication at best. I will call to your attention also the fact that both of these fellows are fiery socialists and revolutionists from Russia, and a factory to them means a prison and a slave dungeon. So they don't want to work because they're socialists. Waldman wrote back, and Waldman, I asked the question yesterday to the Mondells about the casting of the film, because the actors who played the roles just seemed to me to capture what I could read of these people so effectively. And Waldman, I think, is especially true. He comes across in the film, as he comes across in his letters, as this incredibly humane and kind and responsible guy, a very good manager, a very sort of hard-nosed kind of business guy, but with a touch of sort of humanity. And I think his diplomacy dealing with these local communities is an example of that. So here's what he said to the guy worried about socialism. He said, personally, this is Waldman, personally, I am neither a socialist nor a revolutionist, but I assure you that were I in Russia, I would also be a revolutionist. What self-respecting man could be otherwise in that country? Give them a fair chance and be somewhat considerate. So we're trying to work out then differing points of view in 200 plus locations. It's a tremendously detailed and complex process. That's why it didn't work as well as intended. What is still missing, though, from this, and where I sort of would hope to continue some research, is who are these immigrants? Who are the 9,000 to 10,000 people who were put into this situation or chose to be in this situation? And what ultimately happened to them? If I had my own research institute, if I had infinite money, if I had Zuckerberg money, and I wanted to do something with it, I would like to have a staff to help me create biographies of all 10,000 immigrants. Who are each of them? What happened to them over time? This is not possible. At least it's not possible for me, with limited resources. But what I've done to try to make a start at that is to begin with this group. This is the first group that arrived on board the SS Castle, and I think it's Castle. I heard Cassell yesterday. I think it's Castle, but I don't know. Somebody who speaks German would have to tell us. But the SS Castle arrived on July 1st, 1907. It was the first of the Galveston Movement ships. There were 56 Jewish immigrants on board. 54 men and 2 women. The women were Hannah Hinden, who was married to another of the immigrants, Jacob Hinden, and Esther Fivashenko, who was traveling with her brother, Lazar Fivashenko. So both women were related to men in the group. They weren't traveling singly or alone, as they almost never did. The average age of this group was 26. A little over half of them are married, even though only one is traveling with a spouse, right? A little over half are married, which does suggest spouses and children intended to follow. There were no children in this first group, although there would be many to come. There was one family that, for a reason I don't know, remained behind in Bremen. So a guy showed up, his wife and kids were literally on the docks still in Bremen, and they came 2 weeks later on the next ship and rejoined him. But the castle had no children in the first group. What I tried to do with this group is to start with an absolutely critical historical document. This also comes from the files of the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau. And this is a document that I have come to describe sort of in my own thinking about it as a destination list. And I have, out of the files, I've been able to collect the destination lists for about a third of the Galveston ships, really the earliest ones. So I have them pretty complete from 1907 to about 1909 or 10. And what each list shows, as you can see, is the name of the immigrants on board that ship who were handled by the Bureau, their age, their occupation or trade, their marital status, place of origin, and destination. This is where we're sending them. That column is the gold ring as far as my being able to trace these folks. I've got to know where they went. I can't just start searching for Eli, Eli Epstein is one of them. I can't search America for Eli Epstein because there's going to be way too many. But if I know I'm looking for Eli Epstein in Iowa, well, I might be able to find him. If I know where he went, I have a better opportunity of discovering them. So I'm starting with the destination list and literally going name by name, and then searching the documents in Ancestry, searching newspaper archives online, naturalization records, marital records, death records, of course, whatever I might be able to find that would help me get a sense of where they went and what happened to them. I have been able to find, of the 56 passengers on board the Castle, I've been able to positively identify 43 of them, which is 77% of the group. The others either changed their name to something I don't know and I don't know how to find them, or there are too many people with the same name and I don't know which one it is. Whatever the problem is, I've been able to find 77% of the group, which I think is a pretty good, at least starting point. I can't draw too many conclusions, but can definitely get some sense of the outlines of what may have happened to them. The Castle immigrants were sent to 18 cities in 9 states. Only 4 remained in Texas. They were sent to Fort Worth, and they were sent there because they demanded it. It was not the Bureau's choice to send them there. The immigrants knew somebody, they came, all 4 of them together, and absolutely insisted that's where they were going. So that's where they went. All of the others went to the Midwest. The numbers on these pins indicate how many went to each place. Kansas City was, again, the largest single recipient. I can try to draw a few conclusions, again, from limited data here, but just sort of looking at a sample. What happened? The first thing that is immediately apparent about this first group is that most drifted. They left, and most drifted very quickly. About a third of them had drifted by the 1910 census. That is, so they were in the place, they were settled for no more than 3 years before they moved on to somewhere else of their choosing. 80% of them, roughly, drifted at some point in their lives. So altogether, only 9 of the original Castle immigrants, only 9 of the 43 that I found, actually died in the city where they were sent. This is what their drifting looks like. Red pins show the places where they went to and the numbers that went to each of those cities. Blue pins are the ones who stayed put. Those are the 9, and where they actually lived out their lives. It's interesting just to look at the pattern here, and it's immediately obvious. When they left the Midwest, they went to the coasts, right? 7 to LA, 7 to the New York metro area, several others on the East Coast, others on the West Coast. A few stayed in the general region. They moved from one Midwestern city to another, typically Chicago, obviously, but this was a coastal migration. The number that wound up in New York should be of concern, right? Because the whole point of this movement was to get them away from New York. And the largest single group wound up right where they weren't supposed to be. They made their own decision to return. This was something that certainly the movement leadership was aware of and frustrated by. This was a constant source of sort of undermining of their goals. Those who stayed, the 9 who actually lived out their lives where they were placed, there are a couple of things that I think they have in common. One in particular that maybe helps explain why they stayed. Those who were sent to Kansas City, Minneapolis, Oklahoma City, and St. Joseph, Missouri. Those are the locations of those who remained. They went as groups. Those were also the 4 largest recipient communities of this first shipment. And so when they went with others, when they had a community, when they had a sense of camaraderie, when they went, as in the case of the Oklahoma City couple, that's the Hindens, the married couple who went together to Oklahoma City. If they're traveling with support, they're more likely to find a home and to stay. Maybe I'm drawing too much of a conclusion from limited data, but I think that makes sense. Let me read you this as a piece of evidence of the same too. This is a letter by one of the Castle immigrants named Aaron Luzansky, who was sent all by himself to Grand Island, Nebraska. I don't know who he upset or why that happened to him, but Grand Island, Nebraska. Almost as soon after he arrived, he wrote to Morris Waldman and said this: "Send me to another town where some of my friends are. I have no friends here in the boarding house, and they speak nothing but English where I work. Please send me to a new place." Sign of desperation there and loneliness. Waldman was not able to accommodate. He said, "You need to stay in Omaha. Stay in Grand Island where you have work." As soon as Luzansky was able, he moved to Omaha, the closest big city, and he stayed there the rest of his life, or nearly the rest of his life. So I think this sort of gives us some sense of the frequency of drifting and the importance of that in understanding this movement. The Galveston movement was a way for people to get into the country. It didn't necessarily lead to development or growth in all of those 236 communities. That doesn't mean that the Jewish population got bigger and more diverse. That would need to be looked into. It might have in some of those places. But we can't immediately assume that 236 destinations means 236 growing Jewish communities. A lot of these were very temporary residences. Few other sort of general observations about the first group. I found 35 of them became US citizens. That's 81% of those I found. One of them returned to Russia almost immediately and never came back. 3 died in the US before becoming naturalized, but having begun the process. So they would have been. But 81% is a pretty good figure. Clearly remaining and becoming a citizen was a priority for them. Of the Castle immigrants, 19 brought family to rejoin them. That's 44% of those I found. That's significant, of course. Remember, half of them were married. They left families behind. Nearly all of them were able eventually to reunite with those families. 5 of them brought their families through Galveston. So the families of Galveston immigrants became Galveston immigrants and followed the same route to join their husband. This is called chain migration. And for people who study immigration, this is one of the most important factors. One person brings more people. One immigrant brings many more. And it sort of continues an ongoing chain that helps to build communities. Of those 19 Castle immigrants who brought family, they brought a total of 63 people. So 19 people brought 63 more. And that really indicates the scope and the importance of this. And then finally, the question of longevity. How long did they live? And what happened to them eventually in their lives? The first of the Castle group to die was 1917. A guy named Isaac Waxman, who had been sent to Kansas City. and died after just 10 years. His wife remarried and had a long life, as far as I could tell. The last to die was Jacob Hinden, who went by Ginden in Oklahoma City. This was the married couple. Jacob and Anna Ginden were sent to Oklahoma City, where they lived the rest of their lives. Jacob lived until 1977, so he spent 70 years in Oklahoma City. That was unusual, at least of this first group. That kind of durability was rare, but it says, something went right for him. One thing I have not done, and sort of don't expect to do because it's just overwhelming, but I haven't tried to do the descendants of the Galveston immigrants, all the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. I have no idea, the overwhelming task that would be to trace 10,000 genealogies, up to the present day. But it's probably safe to assume that there are at least hundreds and probably thousands of descendants of Galveston immigrants who still probably are scattered throughout the country. The experiences of the immigrants, when you sort of study their life stories, they reveal a very wide cross-section of experiences and some somewhat unusual circumstances. One of the Castle guys became a concessionaire with a traveling circus, traveled all around the United States selling food out of a cart, and wound up dying in North Carolina, rural North Carolina, where I take it the circus happened to be when he dropped dead. At least two of them traveled back to Russia and returned, which I didn't know was possible. We sort of think of this as a one-way trip, but this was a two-way trip for them. They came, they settled, they went back, they visited. One of them took care of a wife there who was sick, and then he returned right back through Galveston and right back to Kansas City. This guy was a Galveston immigrant twice on two different occasions. One of them brought his wife and daughters with him to live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But after a few years, the whole family moved back to New York, settled in New York, and then he left them, disappeared. His wife told a census taker in 1930 that he had died, but he had not died. He had moved to Los Angeles and married another woman. I have him on a ship manifest with his second wife / girlfriend on a ship to Hawaii and back, basically on vacation. So they're not all, charmers, but it's all of humanity. One of the Castle passengers, and this is an sort of endearing story. One of the Castle passengers who lived in Kansas City had a grandson who was born and raised in Kansas City, who married the daughter of another Castle immigrant. That is, the two guys apparently lived in the same city and maintained some sort of family contact for years so that their children wound up, or children wound up marrying each other. And then I want to talk in a little bit more detail about one guy who we're familiar with. Not that, this. The fellow standing on the left, clean shaven, wearing sort of the ranger hat. We have all seen him in this picture. There's another picture. In fact, this is the other picture you've probably seen of Henry Cohen. And there he is again. That is Alexander or Alexis Bagusin, Bagusin. He was obviously with the Castle in the first group. He was identified in correspondence of the movement, which is how I was able to point him out in the picture. He was sent to Quincy, Illinois, along with another guy off the Castle. They couldn't find work for a while, but the community came through, found them jobs. Bagusin was extremely happy with his situation in Quincy. And he was visited a year later by another sort of traveling agent working for the Bureau, who reported this. So this is a description. Despite his residence of but 1 year in this country, he answered my questions in faultless English, had attended evening high school during the winter. And as evidence of his rapid Americanization, he informed me that he was now a full-fledged member of the Illinois Naval Reserve. And more important still, he is a good working man and gives complete satisfaction to his employer. Bagusin worked for several years in Quincy, went to college at the University of Illinois and graduated, served during World War I in the US Army, became naturalized and served. He didn't serve overseas, but he was briefly in the Army in 1918, and then completed his education at Harvard Medical School. I actually have him in the 1920 census studying in Cambridge as a medical student. He completed his work. He became a doctor. He taught for a time at the medical school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., the African American HBCU in Washington, D.C. And then he set up a private practice in Baltimore, which he maintained for the rest of his life. Did extremely well. This, just as a piece of trivia, is the estate sale advertisement when Bagusin died. He had no children and his wife had predeceased him. So basically they sold off everything in their home. And what this kind of indicates, this is a guy who did well, did extraordinarily well. They're not all that successful by a far cry, but this does kind of show us the potential and the possibility of coming through Galveston. What all of this, I think, maybe helps us do is try to refine some conclusions about the kind of perennial question, which is, was this a success? Was this even a good idea? And did this work out? If we think about the Galveston movement as sort of the macro level, Jacob Schiff's view and that point of view, it was a failure, and there's really no other way to see it. He wanted to divert Jewish immigration to Texas permanently. That clearly didn't happen. 10,000 people went to Galveston when 2 million went to New York. It just barely registers. He wanted to discourage the passage of anti-immigrant legislation in Congress. That failed. In 1921, we got the Quota Acts and the most restrictive legislation we've ever had. So the goals that Schiff hoped to pursue did not succeed. But if we look at this from the point of view of the immigrants themselves and the lives they were able to lead, we have to see that they had opportunities, they had chances that they would not have had otherwise. Most of them were good. They were going to come to the US anyway, but they had a better opportunity here and better options here than they would have had if they had stayed in New York. So that is what I have to say. I would be very happy to take questions. I see there's a lot in the chat. I might need some help unpacking that. Let me
okay.
Stop my share here. Hi, Sally. Thanks.
Hi. So there is Philip Goldstone wanted to know if tracing them, not being able to trace them because they changed their last name.
Yes. What is the question?
That just, he said, is that a reason?
Oh, is that a reason I can't find them? Oh,
yes.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the names, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the names were recorded in handwriting, and the handwriting is often very difficult to read. Now that we have computers automatically reading the handwriting, they frequently get it wrong. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this, but when you're searching for somebody by name and ancestry, if their name is misspelled, it doesn't turn up in the search, or you might miss it completely. So it's not just that they change their names, it's that their names are mistranscribed in the search engines, which just makes it impossible to locate them.
Okay, Heather asked, do you have any idea of the literacy of the immigrants that came over?
Of the
literacy.
Oh, of the immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
No, actually, I don't. That's a great question. And I have, I think, no information about that. As far as I ever saw, most were at least functionally literate in Yiddish. And they did write to Waldman pretty regularly. But there were a number of cases where there'd be like a letter from a group where like one guy kind of wrote the ideas for 10. And I don't know if that means the other 10 couldn't write or chose not to, or, I have no idea. But it's an interesting question. Very interesting.
Just, when you said chain migration and what it was, even though a different time, and my father came through New Orleans, my father came from Poland as part of chain migration, as I'm sure a lot of members of TJHS in New Mexico, it was his parents came first and then he came last, and they came with his sister and his brother, and then my father came.
This is the Jewish experience in America. It's everybody's experience in America, right? This is how immigration works. And what we're seeing with the Galveston movement, though, is something that's unique because it's being organized and sort of controlled to some degree.
Okay,
which is rare.
Said that we were told yesterday that only 1 or 2 of the immigrants were sent to each town, but I see here that several were sent to one destination.
Mm-hmm. Kansas City got more than 700. So there was, as far as I know, that's not accurate. I don't think there was any attempt to limit them. Where that it's possible that idea comes from is that they did try not to send them to towns that were too small, right? They're not going to send 10 people to Hamilton, Texas. So they did try not to overwhelm a community. So there would have been some cap, some limit on how many they would send. But I'm not aware that there was ever a discussion of, we don't want to send too many people even to a big city. If Kansas City could absorb them, or Des Moines could, or Minneapolis, they went, as many as they could possibly send.
Our anonymous attendee wants to know, is Emden, EMDEN, departure port was the same as Bremen?
I'm not sure where that is, where that was seen, but I would have to assume it is. Yeah, because there was only one departure port. They didn't leave Europe from anywhere except Bremen.
Okay.
Which offered direct service, which is why Galveston, by the way, no stopping over in Cork, with all the possible difficulties of that. So it went direct from Bremen, Germany. It did stop briefly in an East Coast port and then continued on.
Okay. Then Hollis put in a comment in the chat that regarding drift to the coast, many Soviet refuseniks who settled in Fort Worth in the 70s, 80s also drifted to larger Russian communities in Florida, Houston, and New York.
That is interesting. Thank you, Hollis. Hi, Hollis. I'm glad you're here.
Yes, hi.
I would never have made that connection, but that's brilliant. That's really interesting, because it kind of suggests that there are larger patterns here, right? This is not just the way the Galveston movement worked, but this is how immigration to the United States works.
Okay.
Or at least Jewish immigration.
And Betty Evans, Betty's asking a question I wanted an answer for. You mentioned that the immigrants were sent to communities where there were already Jews. How did those earlier Jews get there?
There's a famous story, and Hollis can back me up on this story, but the story that Jacob Rader Marcus used to tell, who was the sort of dean of American Jewish archiving and one of the founders of the American Jewish history field. And Marcus made the observation that nobody was ever the first Jew into a town, because there was always another one there when he got there. Mm-hmm. And of course, that doesn't explain how that happened. Where did the first one come from? But there just always was one. I'm not sure anybody really knows that. Where did these communities actually originate? Mm-hmm. Is hard to determine. But there were, the point here was not even just we want to send them where there are Jews. We want to send them where there's organization, not just where he'll have a friend, but we want to send them to where there's a community and there's a synagogue and there is a Jewish social service and a business community that can make sure he's employed. They were really looking for substantial Jewish communities, not just little onesies here and there.
And Philip Goldstone made a comment to check the scroll of Galveston TJHS archives for the names of children and grandchildren by last name. And actually, Bryan, we're going to look at that in next month. I have to take some things to the archives, and several of us are going in. We're going to be looking at that scroll.
I don't know what scroll you're referring to.
I think I think, Barbara, are you on? Barbara Rosenberg, are you on? Is that the scroll that you're talking about that you gave?
Barbara wouldn't be on. Barbara can't speak on.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it another time, Sally. But
okay.
I'd like to find out what that is.
Okay. Let me see if there's any more. Have you discovered any immigrants who were rejected entry at the port in Germany and sent back, but then returned at a later date with a successful entry?
Yes. I can't think of a specific case by name right now, but yes, that definitely happened. Rejected at the port in Galveston, not the port in Germany, but people who arrived in Galveston were sent back and then tried again another time. Some of them tried again at Ellis Island and got in, or just tried another port, which was, again, very common. I mean, people who would be rejected almost always returned,
okay.
if they could afford to.
All right, I have two questions. Mm-hmm. Who asked it first? Heather is asking, were Galveston Movement immigrants employed at Jewish-run businesses and non-Jewish run
Boy,
business?
boy, these are good questions. Mostly Jewish-owned businesses, because that's where the connections were. If that was unable to secure, then yeah, some of them would work at non-Jewish firms. But a lot of these are like in places like Kansas City or Minneapolis, they're going to work at big factories or big department stores. Esther Fivashenko, who was the other woman on board the Castle, worked at a department store in Minneapolis selling hats and dresses or something. It was a Jewish-owned store, like, weren't all of them. But there were others who maybe couldn't find those positions and would take what they could find. So because of the networking, it was more likely to be a Jewish business, but it didn't have to be.
Okay, and Linda Goff wants to know, of the original married men, how many did not bring their families?
I'd have to actually go back and look at my notes and see exactly which ones did and didn't. I think ultimately probably the married men all did bring their families. Some of them took a long time, decades before they did. But I can't think of one now where I at least ever noted, oh, he basically never went back for her. I think they all rejoined. I assume there were some who perhaps the wife had died in the meantime. Sometimes it really did take a long time to get the funds to do this. But it was clearly the intent with all of them, and clearly a goal. Some of them brought their families within months. They were sending for them almost immediately if they could.
Okay. Ron Hart wants to know if you can comment on the large number going to Iowa and Minnesota.
Sure, Ron.
What do you want to know, Ron?
Oh, if I can comment, or if
yes,
you can comment.
If you can comment.
Oh, if I can comment. I thought Ron wanted to comment.
No,
Okay.
He's waiting.
Well, I'm not sure what to say. These were more substantial Jewish communities than I was aware of until I started looking at this. I've tried to collect a little bit of material. I haven't been able to read through it yet, but on the history of the Jews of Cedar Rapids and Des Moines and Minneapolis and St. Paul. And these are pretty substantial Jewish communities, certainly rivaling anything we had in Texas at that time. And so they are equal opportunities for work in manufacturing and sales and the sorts of places that these immigrants were going. And so it does seem to me maybe surprising that Iowa was, such a significant destination. It was throughout the history of the movement, one of the largest. I don't know what happened to them. And this is something I'd really like to, I suspect that most of them wound up in Chicago. But I don't know. So there's work to do.
Hollis is commenting, might Alex Babison's clean-shaven face indicate that he was ready to acculturate and integrate into the mainstream? Can you sometimes judge an immigrant by this first impression?
Yes, I think you can. And in fact, that's how I was able to identify him, because in the letter, it specifically says he's the clean-shaven fellow in the front. And so that's how we know who he is. There's a story, Alexander Gurwitz tells a story in his memoir about being on the ship with a guy who shaved during the Atlantic Passage, who basically disappeared into his cabin, the day before they were to land, and had shaved himself clean as the sign of, I am an American now. So I think that certainly was at least symbolic. It's kind of surprises me maybe more of them than just Bagusin had done that, but don't know.
Okay. And Philip added a comment about the scroll. You may not see a lot of names there because they had to pay a small fee on that Galveston scroll.
Okay.
Linda Goff said, having lived near Des Moines, many came from Chicago beginning in the 1880s. Alan and Cynthia, this is a fascinating study. Your presentation is wonderfully historically rich. Can you please tell us what motivated you to do this Herculean project? This is hugely fascinating.
What motivated me? I've had this sort of interesting opportunity to kind of go from thing to thing. I mean, I started my research in graduate school and I wrote this history of the Jews of Texas. And Alexander Gurwitz was a piece of that. I had found his memoir in the library at UT Austin, and used it pretty extensively in the book, and kind of held on to the idea I wanted to get it published. So that became the second thing. Then writing about the Galveston movement to do that book got me thinking more about the Galveston movement and digging through documents. And I found this old thing in the file drawer and went, what is this? And started looking more deeply at that. So that's led to the next thing. And this is sort of how it goes, sort of associative research. So this is something that I've wanted to do for a while, and probably will be doing for a while. I have no idea how I'm going to actually complete this. But
okay, just so everybody knows, I'm switching from the chat and the Q&A at the same time. Ann Ackerman wants to know if we can provide a list to the scrolled list, a link to the scrolled list.
I don't know what that is, but Sally,
okay,
you
so,
can.
all right. So for Ann, as I said, I'm going to the archives next month. I will ask our liaison about that, or you can email me and remind me, or I can get you in contact with our liaison about that scroll. Philip Goldstone wants to know where your ancestors came from and which port did they land in?
My ancestors?
Yes.
New York. We were not Galveston immigrants. But so this is not a personal thing for me. It's just sort of more of a historical thing.
Okay.
But our family's from the same place everybody else's is. I mean, from Russia, Romania, Lithuania. And all of us were here. My dad's on the call, and I'm going to get this wrong, and he knows better. But I'm pretty sure we were all here by 1900, probably 1890 even.
Okay.
But mostly through New York, not directly to Texas.
Karen Hoffman-Dorr wants to know, were immigrants ever not assigned work and just allowed to go where they wanted and fend for themselves?
No, not phrased that way. That is, they weren't just cut loose in Galveston. They were consulted, and there were a lot of cases where they, for some reason, had a particular destination they wanted to go to, and if that could be accommodated, it would be. So that often did mean sending them somewhere where there wasn't a job waiting. That was often the case, but there was a brother-in-law, or there was a friend from the old country, or whatever. The immigrants frequently made requests, basically, of where they wanted to go, and those would be accommodated if they could. But I don't think the whole point was to look after them. I don't think they just cast anyone off and said, good luck to you. They sent them somewhere, and then at that point, the immigrant would become autonomous and could do what they pleased.
Okay. Philip Pickman has given his email because he said Marilyn Chiat, Chiat, in Minneapolis can provide lots of information on the history of Jews in Minneapolis.
Good, thank you.
So I've got that contact for you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Hang on a minute. Judith Heller said a couple of the Iowa locations on Bryan's list are still on the rail line, like Otuma.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the railroads had a lot to do with this. Somebody mentioned that yesterday, and that's absolutely true. These were on the map I showed you. I'm not sure I can pull it back up here now, but you can almost trace the rail lines out through the Southwest. You could see the pins at every town through West Texas and New Mexico and Arizona to LA. And you could just see how they're just jumping off the train at all these various towns. The same was true the Northern Pacific, up the northern part of the country. And so the railroads and the ability to get to particular places had a huge impact on where they would wind up.
Were there any complaints about the weather from immigrants, and did they have proper coats? Heather's asking.
Wow, interesting. You mean if you're going to send somebody to Minnesota, do you warn them first? I didn't read of any complaints about that. There was some discussion at the opposite extreme, that Texas is really hot and humid. In fact, some of the reports that I showed you the page of the reports of the towns, the reports from Houston actually specifically said it's really hot here. And so you need to be prepared for that. I didn't see reports about the cold. These are folks from Russia. I assume they were comfortable, living with the polar bears. So it's not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Interesting.
Philip Goldstone wants to know if your books are available at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts.
I think the Gurwitz book is. I doubt that the Chosen Folks is. They're both available on Amazon if you want to buy them, but and at your local library probably. But I can't speak to a particular library. I do think the Gurwitz book wound up there because it was written in Yiddish and they had an interest in it.
Okay.
It's been
hang
some
on.
time since I checked.
I've lost something. Hang on.
Mhm.
Okay, I think that's all the questions in the Q&A. I know we're almost running out of time. Let me get to the chat.
I appreciate this, folks. This is fun. Thanks for the questions.
Who is your favorite character in the story of the Galveston movement?
Wow. I'm thinking there's so many, right? I think Bagusin stands out only because it felt like such an accomplishment to be able to identify him. That's a picture that I've seen, of course, a million times, that all of us have. I had no idea who any of them actually are. And that was always sort of bugging me. It's like, these are a bunch of people. Who are they? They're the immigrants. And to be able to actually put a name on one and a life story was really important to me. And the fact that he was just a mind-blowing success story. It's like, excuse me, he went to Harvard Medical School. Really stands out from the norm here. He's not the norm by any stretch, but it was to me a really meaningful story to connect with.
Hollis's comment was fascinating research comparable to Who Came on the Mayflower.
It's better than Who Came on the Mayflower, but thank you, Hollis.
It says the Soviet refuseniks brought their furs, just like the Galveston immigrants to Minnesota. Minnesota likely brought their furs and woolens. Okay, Philip Goldstone is commenting again about the scroll. It's not on our website. Philip, email me. I'll put my email in the chat and we can talk about that. I think, let me scroll through everything again. Sheldon, like the first group on Castle, was photo taken of all the ship passengers.
Good. No, sadly. And sadly, that one is not good. That group photo of the group when they arrived, that was done as a publicity thing. Some local newspaper reporter came by and took a group shot, and it's a terrible picture. And they actually complained about it. The managers asked not to distribute it. It wound up, I found it in a newspaper in the LA Times. I have no idea why, but I found it there. As far as I know, there were no other pictures taken at the entry point. But the first group was photographed pretty extensively because they were the first group, and there was a lot of interest in not only recording the moment and sort of documenting it, but advertising what they were doing. They wanted publicity shots to be able to distribute in Europe and to distribute elsewhere in the U.S. And so they were trying to come up with some good ones. That one they were disappointed in, and I'm disappointed. You can't see their faces when you look at it. You can't really tell anything about them. Just this one's got a beard, that one doesn't. This, it's a completely pixelated, just badly made photo. I would love to find an original of it. I've never been able to. I've been checking with some archives and nobody has it. So, well, I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, I'm looking through everybody just to make sure I've gotten everything in the chat and everything in Q&A. Barbara, is that your mom, Barbara, who wants to be
possible?
I don't know. I have a feeling today is like yesterday that some people are getting double named on IDs. Are there any other questions? Chats, because I think I've covered everybody.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Well, good. Well, thank you all so much. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the questions. It's always nice to be able to try this stuff out. I'm thinking about it a lot. I don't know how it actually sounds. So it's very helpful to be able to tell people about it. I appreciate the opportunity very much.
Well, I'm
thank you, Sally, for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm going to comment as what others have said. This was a great presentation and scholarly, and the charts and it's the visuals. Thank you. This was very informative.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm glad.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, thanks again, Bryan. We will take another 5-minute break, I believe it is, and then resume at 11:20 for the session on the Meyers Brothers. So don't go away, but take a 6-minute break. You got 6 minutes. All right, it is now my privilege to introduce, let's see, one moment, Janet Sayers, who is a member of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, and she will introduce the next session.
Yes, and good morning, everyone, from the land of enchantment. And I'm very pleased to introduce Naomi Sandweiss, who was born in Albuquerque. She's a past president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society and also a recipient of the Society's Hearst Award, which is the highest award given by the Society. She is the author of Jewish Albuquerque and numerous other articles on Jewish and Western history. She has a background in nonprofit management, but is currently working remotely for the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, Texas. She has a master's in education and is completing a master's in history from Arizona State University. So I give you Naomi Sandweiss.
Thank you so much, Janet. And I want to thank both societies for the opportunity to share this history. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And I hope you all can see it. Let me get to the point where it is showing as a slideshow. If you bear with me. Okay, so I have found this entire conference fascinating so far, and wanted to mention that the brothers of whom I'm speaking today were not part of the Galveston movement, but interestingly enough, came to the United States at the exact same time to the Southwest. These gentlemen were my grandfather's uncles, and I think you'll find in the stories that I share with you today that they had very similar experiences to those of Jewish immigrants in other areas, such as chain migration and building and having leadership positions in their communities. So to go ahead and introduce the family was actually from Latvia, and the siblings, David and Louis, were 2 of 5 siblings that were born in Latvia, and the family immigrated to the UK. Their name originally was probably Meyer, M-E-R-R, and it was anglicized to Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, and Myers, M-Y-E-R-S. And their oldest brother, Joseph, was actually the first person to immigrate to the UK. That was my great-grandfather. And they also had a sister, Ida, who came to the United States in 1895. And so there came a point at which the brothers, David and Louis, decided they wanted to come to the United States as well. This was in approximately 1905. And my great-grandfather, Joseph, wanted to join them, but had vision problems and wasn't accepted as a candidate for immigration at all. So David and Louis actually came through the port in Philadelphia, like I said, approximately in 1905. And as I mentioned, they were trained as tailors and came pretty readily to St. Louis. And they married 2 sisters who were Lithuanian born, Annie and Yetta. And interestingly enough, and maybe, a very good reason for why these brothers weren't candidates, of course, for Galveston is they weren't coming directly from Russia. They had already learned to read and write English in addition to their knowledge of Yiddish before coming to the United States as a result of living in the UK. One of the sisters, Annie, had health problems in terms of asthma, and like many others, it was advised that she come to a dry climate. So they moved from St. Louis to Salt Lake City for a time, but did not find it hospitable and relocated to Albuquerque by 1914. And so both families actually lived together in Albuquerque. And just to share with you a bit about religious observance, in the previous talk, Dr. Stone mentioned that the individual he found was clean shaven. And this picture was taken of the brothers and their brother-in-law shortly after they came to the United States. And you can see they're definitely clean shaven, but they are wearing hats and talit. The brothers and the family kept kosher. They were relatively traditional in their religious observance. And interestingly enough, the 1910 census listed their native language as English, but the 1920 census listed it as Hebrew, which was, of course, really Yiddish. So they were comfortable communicating, and certainly in both languages. So when they settled in Albuquerque, we had mentioned the railroad earlier. The railroad really led to the development of Newtown, Albuquerque, which was incorporated 5 years after the railroad came in 1885. And the population when the brothers came in Albuquerque was approximately 11,000. There were other Jewish merchants, retailers, and wholesalers, primarily stacked along Railroad Avenue, which was later named Central Avenue. So many of these retailers and wholesalers were Jewish pioneers who had come to New Mexico earlier and had set up operations in other places such as Santa Fe and Las Vegas, but eventually worked their way down to Albuquerque because of the business opportunities that the railroad really afforded. Many of you recognize the names of Grunsfeld, Rosenfeld, Ilfeld, etc. These individuals, along with others, had founded a Reformed congregation in 1897. So that was the Albuquerque to which David and Louis Meyer and their wives, Annie and Yetta, arrived. And so they set up a business at primarily a men's store. And you can see a later photograph of it down on the lower right, pictured in 1937 along Central Avenue. The families actually lived together on a small farm. They kept chickens, they grew fruit trees, and the David and Annie Meyer had one son who was born before they got to Albuquerque, and Louis and Yetta had 3 children in Albuquerque. The family wasn't comfortable with Reform observance. They were looking for something more traditional. So they actually were part of the founding of Temple B'nai Israel in Albuquerque. And you can see on the top right, this is the home of Annie and David and their son Jack Meyer in approximately 1920, where services were held, and you can see there's a Torah in the back. They used this, and in addition to many other rented locations, for 20 years after the congregation was founded, until they finally built a building later in about 1941. So, but those years, they sustained themselves with having religious school and religious observance. Like many other Jewish merchants, they kept their business open on Saturdays, although they were otherwise observant, and they did keep kosher as much as possible in terms of getting meat by railroad from other places when they couldn't get kosher meat in Albuquerque. The family was very involved beyond the Jewish community in the larger social and civic life of Albuquerque. So David Meyer belonged to B'nai B'rith, of course, but the Rotary, Kiwanis, Shriners, and Community Chest, which was the predecessor of United Way. And Annie Meyer, his wife, belonged to the Order of the Eastern Star and was active in the sisterhood of B'nai Israel. So they were very engaged in the community. Albuquerque Jewish life before World War II largely consisted of merchants. And as I mentioned, 2 synagogues were maintained, the Reformed Congregation Albert from 1897, and I'm calling it the Conservadox B'nai Israel. Depending on the rabbi, it kind of switched affiliations there, but of course, early on, a cemetery was organized at Fairview by B'nai B'rith. And in Albuquerque, organizations such as B'nai B'rith, Sisterhood, and Hillel flourished in later years between the 30s and the 50s. So this was the life that they were a part of. Also, Albuquerque life in general, Albuquerque was growing during this time. The Air Force Base certainly brought in more Jews. And during the Depression, Albuquerque, like Amarillo, that I'll discuss in a moment, was a center for federal relief programs as far as bringing in federal dollars. In 1921, Lewis and Yetta decided to move to Amarillo, 288 miles east of Albuquerque. This did not represent any sort of family rift. The families were always very close, again, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. But I think they decided this was a good business opportunity for them. The climate was similar, but they weren't as concerned with the health concerns that David and Annie were. And so they and their 3 children moved to Amarillo in 1921. Amarillo, like Albuquerque, was a railroad community. In 1888, the railroad came through. And after the railroad came, and there were approximately 3 Jewish families in Amarillo. And in 1913, Temple Beth Israel was founded. And remains, with one exception that I'll mention later, the only Jewish congregation in Amarillo. In 1919, so around the time Lewis and Yetta came, there were 30 members, and the monthly services were in English. Amarillo was a growing community. There were oil and gas discoveries nearby. And in 1920, when they arrived, there were about 15,000 residents, and it grew significantly. So by 1940, and this includes the time of the Depression, there were 50,000 residents. In Amarillo, Polk Street was the main drag, and many Jewish merchants had general stores and other businesses along Polk. One of the biggest places was Levine's department store, but there were lots of others. And the couple opened up Meyer and Meyer as an outpost of the Meyer and Meyer in Albuquerque. So they had one location and until about 1936. And in 1936, they had a grand opening at a different location on Polk Street where they had an orchestra and, a whole big kind of celebration. And all of the children, each of their children, Albert and Shirley, they worked in the store and attended local schools, as did Jack in Albuquerque. In 1937, there were 335 Jews in Amarillo, and the Air Force Base was established in 1942 as well. So you can see there were many similarities between Albuquerque and Amarillo, and it made sense for the brothers and sisters to be together in business in these two very similar communities. Like Albuquerque, prior to the establishment of B'nai Israel, high holidays and other Jewish occasions were observed at rented halls and lodges. And there was also a B'nai B'rith Lodge that was organized a little later, along with a Young Judea and a Zionist group. In the early years of the synagogue, there were rabbis who traveled on a Texas circuit who came to serve the congregation, but eventually the rabbi was secured, and one rabbi, Arthur Bloom, was a refugee, was there for 20 years as rabbi. During World War II, the Jewish community in Amarillo really expanded, partly due to the installation of the Air Force Base, and a cemetery was established. A Jewish section of the local cemetery was established about 1930, and later other organizations such as Hadassah. B'nai Israel built a new building in 1967, and today Amarillo is, and then to some degree as well, is considered the heart of the Bible Belt. Currently, there are 200 churches and 1 synagogue in Amarillo. Like his brother, David, Lewis was involved in the synagogue, but was also involved in civic organizations as well. The family, and there's a photo here of Lewis and Yetta. The family owned a home in Amarillo, and they were concerned about Jewish causes. They contributed to such causes as the Joint Distribution Committee. The families also did a lot of travel together when they could. So in terms of family connections, they primarily kept in touch, writing letters in Yiddish and occasionally driving to see each other between Albuquerque and Amarillo. In 1927, each of the families decided to go back to England for a visit, to visit their, particularly their brother Joseph, who again was my great-grandfather, who had taught them the tailoring trade. And Joseph had another men's store in Bolton where he lived and was also very involved in the synagogue there. The families also went on joint buying trips to buy fabric in New York and Chicago. I want to just circle back to Latvia, because there were remaining family members there. And in 1941, the Nazis invaded their town and murdered the remaining family members. In 1947, my great-grandfather Joseph traveled to the US after the war to visit his brothers. So this was a very close-knit family. And they kept in very close contact. It's interesting to me that despite their geographic distance, each of the 3 brothers essentially followed exceedingly similar paths in life. What is the legacy in Amarillo? Interestingly, Lewis and Yetta eventually moved out of state and went to the East Coast, where the remaining sister lived. They're both buried in suburban Philadelphia. Their children married Jewish individuals, 2 of their children married Jewish individuals from Texas. Shirley married a Jewish man from Fort Worth, David Bernstein. And by 1942, they were living in Fort Worth, 340 miles away from Amarillo. Milton Meyer married Hannah Freeman from Waco in 1947, and they lived in Amarillo for a time. And Albert did set up business in Amarillo for a while. Unfortunately, he began to be involved on the wrong side of the law and remained that way for quite some time. this was not the only family, the Jewish family that seemed to, we'll use the term drift, out of Amarillo. The population currently of Amarillo, the metro area, is about 250,000, of whom 0.1% are currently Jewish. And while there is a Jewish state representative from Amarillo, and the congregation has maintained itself all of this time, the Jewish population is very, very small. And also Amarillo hasn't grown as quickly as Albuquerque did after a certain period of time. In Amarillo today, there is a congregation for people returning to Judaism who may have had a background as crypto-Jews. So there is a very small congregation that does focus on Sephardic returnees, but it still remains that their B'nai Israel is the one congregation in town. As far as Albuquerque legacy goes, I had mentioned that David and Annie's son Jack and his wife Ethel helped fundraise for the original B'nai Israel building and organized the first youth group. And Jack Meyer, the son, was president of B'nai Israel in 1956 and 1957. He served in the US military as a medic. Eventually he wanted to be a physician, but he ended up dropping out and helping to run the family store, the business. The couple, David and Annie Meyer, the original residents, are buried in Fairview Cemetery at the B'nai Israel section. And you see here a picture of my grandparents who came to Albuquerque in 1958. What happened is, as I mentioned, my grandfather Philip here, his father Joseph, couldn't leave the UK. But after the war, in which my grandfather served for the British in Burma, my grandparents and my mother and her sisters moved to Australia, where they stayed for 10 years until they were able to leave the British colonies, and came to Albuquerque in 1958. Jack closed the downtown Meyer and Meyer men's store in 1962, and they moved to the Princess Jean Shopping Center. Albuquerque was moving out of the main business district into more suburban areas, and they followed suit. In Albuquerque, the Jewish population now is approximately 12,000, based on a survey in 2015, but Albuquerque is a much larger community. The metro area has about closer to 900,000 people compared to the 250,000 in Amarillo. Interestingly, about 87% of those who live in Albuquerque were born elsewhere. But today, there are not only 2 synagogues, but also a Havurah, a Jewish community center, additional Jewish organizations. Eventually, in the 1960s, the store was closed. And in the 1940s, the store in Amarillo was closed. Myself and my family are part of the descendants of the Albuquerque part of the Meyers family. And you'll notice there's 2 different spellings. My grandparents and my mother had the last name Myers, as did the British Meyers. But I think it is interesting that there was an Albuquerque and an Amarillo connection. We often get the question, how did Jewish people end up in some of these locations? And in this case, it was due to their interest in coming to America, becoming business owners, and also a health concern that led them out west. So I am happy to answer any questions about the family. Here's some references that I used, but I'm happy to share any part of the presentation, but I'm going to leave the PowerPoint right now, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
All right. So excuse me, the first question, excuse me, is from Isabel asking, did family members embrace or serve Southwestern foods they deemed kosher?
Isabel, that's a really good question. Not that I know of. That I don't believe that at that point they did. In later years, my grandparents certainly did, but we're talking about my grandfather's uncle's generation here. So I don't believe so.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions. Oh, Janet, turn on my video. It is on. Okay. I'll keep looking for questions, but Naomi, could you comment from your book, Jewish Albuquerque, about the very large number of the downtown businesses that were owned by Jewish merchants? I mean, it was just a very large.
Sure. I mean, this followed the path of other cities, like I said, like Amarillo. But essentially, there were Jews operating in Old Town Albuquerque before the railroad came. There were a couple of business people who had stores, but really it was the impetus of the railroad in 1880 that brought others down and to Central. And there were essentially two waves. There was the first wave of representatives of the earlier pioneers, as I mentioned, some of the families, Ilfeld, Rosenwald, Grunsfeld, who had outposts and businesses on Central. But then there was a second Eastern European wave. And my relatives came a little bit before that, but they ran businesses such as People's Flowers and got into Native American, selling Native American items once tourism really started building. As well as other businesses. So in fact, there were some friends and relatives of the family who said that they got off the train in Albuquerque, did a little bit of shopping, and heard Yiddish. And that was what prompted them to move to Albuquerque because they knew they'd feel at home. And so, yes, there was a predominance of Jewish merchants along Central, but the same was true on Polk Street and Amarillo.
I see. Okay. There was a question in the chat or comment that the Texas Jewish Historical Society met in Amarillo several years ago. A very good meeting, including services at the temple.
So the temple is very active. I visited a few years ago as well and went to see the former home and business place, you know, where my relatives had their businesses. And so the synagogue is certainly, you know, still serving the area, but the community as a whole just hasn't had the population as Jews have migrated to larger cities like Houston and Dallas, if they're hoping to stay in Texas. And as my relatives did as well, you know, moved to Fort Worth and other places where opportunity called to them.
And another question in the chat, if you could comment on the development of Jewish organizations in locally in New Mexico, including the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. I think you were one of the founding members, or?
I was not a founding member. I have been a member for about 21 years.
Okay.
But others probably could speak more to the founding of the organization. I will say that certainly Albuquerque, and as I mentioned, Amarillo, I don't want to leave Amarillo out.
Yes.
Has had, again, all of these organizations started to build around the same time. primarily in Albuquerque, the cemetery was the first Jewish affiliated founding of anything, because people needed to bury their loved ones. And you were not going to do so in a church, burial ground. And so in addition to places like Masonic cemeteries and other organizational cemeteries, B'nai B'rith founded the cemetery at Fairview in Albuquerque. And so, but then of course, people needed to have their religious needs met. And there was a little more diversity in Albuquerque in terms of observance. And so different organizations started to do so. Certainly after World War II, organizations such as many women's organizations, the Jewish Women, is it the National Organization of Jewish Women? Correct me if I did not say that right. And Hadassah were founded in addition to Hillel at the university.
And let me check the chat and see if we have.
And I will say that, let me just add something. I had mentioned, and I was corrected, that it was a state senator who is not running for re-election from Amarillo. But I do want to say that Jews early on, and not my particular family, were very involved in civic life. The first mayor of Newtown, Albuquerque, Henry Jaffa, was Jewish. A governor of New Mexico was Jewish. Thank you. The National Council of Jewish Women. I was corrected. There were many Jews who were involved in political life and really made it their business to be boosters for their communities. Albuquerque had an early organization that kind of preceded the Chamber of Commerce, called the Commercial Club. And Jews were very involved in the Commercial Club, trying to boost Albuquerque and bring others, Jewish and non-Jewish, here. So there's been a great deal of civic involvement in addition to religious involvement as well.
And going back to Amarillo, there's a question from Lance Bell. Is there a Jewish cemetery in Amarillo?
There's not. There is a Jewish cemetery as part of a larger cemetery in Amarillo. And that is where my relatives are, some of them were buried, but most of them were buried out of state. And I see there was a comment that the Albuquerque Country Club always admitted Jews, and that's very true as well. And so, when my relative Louis Meyer retired from his business in Amarillo, the whole community came out to celebrate him. They were interested in this article that talked about him, that he dressed some of the most premier politicians and businessmen in Texas in terms of his tailoring and fine suits and menswear. And so they were not only serving the Jewish community, naturally, they were serving the community at large, and at least had business connections with the larger community, if not social connections, but primarily business connections.
And Heather in the Q&A asked if you could, before you finish, show the slide that indicated all of your resources.
Sure.
And research.
Yeah.
Or perhaps you all could also trade that through emails or.
Yeah, why don't I share it through email so that I do that. And then of course there were many articles and family photos that I didn't list on there, but I did list most of the general resources that one might be interested in.
And then also in the Q&A was just a comment about in Las Vegas, New Mexico, the Montefiore, if you want to mention that.
Sure. So the first congregation in New Mexico was Congregation Montefiore in Las Vegas. And then they established a cemetery much earlier than anything was established in Albuquerque or any other place in the state. And it is a project of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society annually to help clean and maintain that cemetery in Las Vegas, where many of the early pioneers are buried. So it is an interesting place to visit and be part of that.
And then another question in the chat, if you could just talk a little bit more about some of the Jewish businesses in Albuquerque. I'm thinking specifically American Furniture being a very huge impact on the Albuquerque economy.
Yeah, American Furniture was the Blogrand business, and the family, I believe, originally either came through or started the business in El Paso and eventually ended up in Albuquerque. They sold the business probably in the 1990s or so, but it was, like many of the other Jewish businesses, extremely successful. I mean, everything from American furnishings to sporting goods stores to music shops to a wide range of businesses were owned by Jewish individuals. And then, of course, the impact of the railroad and the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque and the opportunity for people to stop and purchase things when they got off the train, let's say going to Los Angeles or coming from there. There was definitely an opportunity for Jewish individuals to do that. And there were Jewish individuals who were part of that Harvey House movement to serve those who got on and off the train in Albuquerque. And certainly interesting, someone is mentioning that the two brothers in the Blogrand family had an outpost in Albuquerque and El Paso, similar to my family. Maybe my family was a little less successful, but had two businesses, in one in New Mexico and one in Texas.
And there's a comment in the chat from Jan Hart that she had relatives in Borger, Texas. My goodness, that's a frontier outpost, and had a jewelry store in Amarillo.
So Jan, I'm going to want to talk to you more about that, because there's a possible connection there. So,
and their name was
Levenstein.
Levenstein. And as a teenager growing up in Albuquerque, I remember one of the major downtown stores was Levine's. That was a clothing store it was upscale. And let's see if there's another question in the chat. Okay, there is not. So that, Naomi, if you want to make some closing comments, we can see if there's any more questions, but fascinating. Actually, I didn't quite understand about the Australia, that your grandmother could not leave Australia. They were already married.
So my grandfather, who grew up with his father, was the eldest of those brothers. So they grew up in the UK, and as I said, he served in the British service during World War II. They couldn't leave the Commonwealth with any of their resources until about 10 years after the war. So in 1958, they came to Albuquerque. My grandparents they bought a bakery from an Italian family in Albuquerque and ran a bakery and had a cafe on Central Avenue as well. But they were not here from 1912 on. They were in the UK and Australia.
Okay. All right. Well, quite a few people are thanking you for your presentation. Fascinating, and I will send us back to Sheldon from Texas.
Yes, thank you, Naomi. And you'll be joining us at the breakout session? Okay, so if you have more questions for Naomi, join us in the breakout session later on, around 11 a.m. No, I guess it's later after the next session. But we will be taking a 5-minute break before our last session. Okay, welcome back from the break. It is my pleasure to ask Gloria Abella Ballin, member of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, to introduce our final speaker.
This has been really a pleasure to hear all these papers today. I am glad to be able to introduce Haidee Joy. She is a consultant on international business and trade along the border between the United States and Mexico. Her publications include Maquiladora Monitor and Southern United States Mexico Border Investment Guide, among others. Haidee is currently associated with Seminars International, which focuses on event planning and promotion. She lives in Tucson, Arizona. The subject of her talk is the arrival of Jews in Mexico, their histories and influences. Haidee, it's a pleasure.
Thank you, Gloria. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Gloria. I'd like to thank Linda for following up, and actually, when I contacted her about making this presentation, she was really very gracious and took a giant leap of faith to invite me. And also would like to thank Claudia Bloom, your administrator, for the great assistance that she gave me in coordinating so I could be a presenter today. My presentation is Arrival of Jews in Mexico, the History, Mexican Jewish Life and Influences. The history of Jews arriving in Mexico dates back to 1519. This group of early arrivals of Jews in Mexico had many names, and one of them was conversos. These early arrivals of Jews in Mexico were Spanish and Portuguese, Jews living in the Iberian Peninsula who converted or were forced to convert to Christianity during the Middle Ages, although continued to practice Judaism in secrecy. During the colonial period from 1521 to 1821, a number of Jews came to Mexico when Mexico established religious toleration during the 19th century and liberal reform. Jews could openly immigrate to Mexico. Jewish immigrated from Europe and other countries like Syria, Lebanon, and countries from the crumbling Ottoman Empire until the first half of the 20th century. Today, most Jews in Mexico are descendants of this immigration. This includes principally Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews and Spanish-speaking Sephardic Jews. The traditional languages of Ashkenazi Jews is Yiddish, a German language with elements of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Slavic languages. Sephardic Jews are a Jewish ethnic group originating from traditional established communities in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. The Mexican Jewish community has strong roots in Mexico. Over the years, has had few problems in its host country. Openly Jews serve prominently in government positions and are found in most spheres of Mexico's business, professions, political circles, intellectual and artistic communities. Mexican Jews have flourished with economic success in a wide range of businesses and industries. Jews living in Mexico from Aleppo, Damascus, and the Balkans and Eastern Europe have had their own synagogues and other organizations and institutions. Ashkenazi Jews have founded newspapers and publications in Mexico. Literature written by Mexican and other Latin American Jewish writers tend to explore the question of what it means to be a Jew in a host country like Mexico. Rosa Nissan has written a number of books related to growing up Jewish in Mexico. During the early 20th century, Jewish immigrants throughout Mexico started a number of religious and social organizations to assist the Jewish community adapt to life in Mexico and conserve their heritage. In Mexico City, there is the Palacio de Marble Palace. There are 10 main organizations in which most of Mexican Jews have an affiliation. In Monterrey, Nuevo León, an industrial city in northern Mexico, there is the Monterrey Community Center. There is the Tijuana, Baja California Community Center, and the Guadalajara Community Center. Most Mexican Jews attend Jewish schools. University students belong to the Mexican Federation of Jewish Students, FEMUJ. The Mexico International Jewish Film Festival attracts mostly non-Jews, a non-Jewish audience, and has expanded from Mexico City to Guadalajara to Monterrey and Cancun and San Miguel de Allende. And also San Miguel de Allende has an established Jewish community. Jews also live in Veracruz, Mexico. Mexican Jews live along the northern border of Mexico and southern United States border. In Greater Mexico City, Jewish communities exist in Colonia Hipódromo, Condesa, Polanco, Lomas de Chapultepec, and Santa Fe. Mexico City has approximately a dozen schools and over a dozen synagogues. Mexico City's biggest Jewish community center, the Centro Deportivo Israelita, is more like a sprawling country club. It houses a full-size Olympic swimming pool, dozens of tennis courts, multiple basketball courts, fronton courts, and that is the highlight game. That is a basket game, a 200-seat theater, 2 full-size soccer fields, a baseball field, men's and women's saunas, a Yiddish and Hebrew library, a beauty salon, and restaurant. Members of the Tijuana Jewish community are immigrants and their descendants from Eastern Europe. They are Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews from countries like Poland, Russia, Lithuania, and Romania. In Tijuana, there are also Sephardic Jews from Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans, as well as Arabic Jews from Syria and Lebanon. Many Tijuana Jewish families immigrated to the United States to the beach communities like La Jolla and Coronado, California, located in San Diego County. In the 1960s, there was a popular retail store in Tijuana, Baja California, by the name of Sarah's, owned by Simon Silvershot and his wife, Maria. There is sadness related to Sarah's. Simon Silvershot and his wife, Maria, were on a plane returning from or going to Israel that was bombed. Sarah's continued, but as for me, it was never the same store in quality or personality. The Tijuana, Baja California Jewish community at most has consisted of approximately 60 Jewish families. Intellectuals, academics, scientists, artists, merchants, manufacturers, public and political officials, and leaders of civic organizations, members of the Jewish community of Mexico contribute their work and talent daily to promote the development of Mexico. With more than a century of organized life, the Jewish community remains firm, united, active, and vibrant, integrated into the social and cultural mosaic of Mexico. Pedro Ramirez Vasquez, the late 20th century Mexican architect and Secretary of Human Settlements and Public Works of Mexico from 1976 to 1982, under his direction, Manuel Rosen was his chief architect, born in Mexico City from Russian Jewish immigrant parents. Manuel Rosen was a world-renowned architect designing amazing icon buildings around the world. The Embassy of Japan, for one, the Olympic swimming pool and gymnasium for the 1968 Olympics held in Mexico City, the Culture Center in Tijuana, and the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, California. Manuel was a professor at the university in Mexico City and other colleges and Northern Mexico universities. In 1992, in a serendipity manner, I met Manuel Rosen, and for 10 years, for a 10-year period, I partnered with Manuel in the development and promotion of industrial parks in Tijuana, Baja California. During these 10 years, Manuel reminisced of the sweet life in artistic circles in Mexico City. Manuel was a practicing Jew and always stated that he was Mexican and he loved his homeland, Mexico, Mexican culture, traditions, and lifestyle. His parents were close friends of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Diego Rivera, a prominent Mexican painter, embraced the Mexico City Jewish community. Rivera's mother was forced to convert from Judaism to Roman Catholicism. Rivera wrote, "My Jewishness is a dominant element in my life, although he was not raised practicing any Jewish faith." Alfredo Ripstein, a Mexican film producer of European and Jewish descent, Ripstein is credited with assisting to shape Mexico's film industry in the period surrounding World War II. Ripstein also helped start the careers of several contemporary Mexican actors, Gabriel Garcia Bernal and Samala Halleck. Ripstein's father was a Polish Jewish merchant in Parral, Chihuahua. Members of Pancho Villa's army were the main customers of his parents' store. Ripstein's mother asked Villa for permission to close the store in order to give birth to Alfredo Ripstein. Ripstein's family moved to Mexico City when he was 6 years old, and there he grew up in Mexico City, and as a young adult was hired by Simon Wishnak, who owned the Filmex company, and he became his production manager and executive producer. Ripstein opened his own company, Alameda Films, in 1948. One of his final feature films was El Crimen del Padre Amado, The Crime of Father Amado. That was in 2002. This film premiered August 16, 2002 in Mexico City. When it was released, The Crime of Father Amado caused a controversy on the part of the Roman Catholic groups in Mexico, who tried to stop the film from being screened. The Roman Catholic groups failed, and the film became the biggest box office draw ever in Mexico. In the United States of America, this film enjoyed commercial success. At the 75th Academy Awards, The Crime of Father Amado was nominated for the Best Foreign Film Oscar, and Ripstein produced more than 120 films and was the brother-in-law of Manuel Rosen. Arturo Ripstein y Rosen, the son of Alfredo Ripstein, is a Mexican film director. Ripstein and Rosen is considered the godfather of independent Mexican cinema. In 1997, Ripstein y Rosen won the National Prize of Arts and Sciences. The National Prize for Arts and Sciences is awarded annually by the government of Mexico in 6 categories. I am in the process, I'm kind of jump over here a little bit, but I'm in the process of locating an exhibit of Synagogue Doors of Mexico. I'm hopeful I will be able to arrange either for a photographic display of this exhibit or in-person exhibit. I personally viewed this exhibit of Synagogue Doors of Mexico a number of years ago. A most impressive exhibit. I will update all attendees of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Annual Conference of updates on sharing this exhibit in the near future. Jews have enjoyed a sweet life in Mexico. Jewish education, culture, and influences are positive and productive and continue to participate and contribute to the development of Mexico and Mexico's prosperity. I did not include figures of the Mexican population in Mexico, but kind of in parentheses, I would say like maybe 50, 60, not more than 100,000. I was just not comfortable with the figures and numbers from limited sources. And it is definitely a minority in Mexico, but with a very high presence. And it just appears like there's so many more Jewish people in Mexico, like thousands and thousands more, because of their high profile and definitely contributed generously to the advancement of Mexico. A little bit about myself. On my mother's side of my family, my great-grandfather, Juan Ayub Aydar, was an immigrant to Mexico from Lebanon. He settled in Santa Rosalia, Baja California, a seaport and copper mining town on the coast of the Sea of Cortez. For well over 50 years, he owned a dry goods store. The majority of his customers were miners. My grandfather, Pancho Ayub, a legend in his region, over the years owned and operated the local businesses, open-air theater, hotel, and wholesale businesses. In his later years, he settled on the Pacific side of the Baja California Peninsula in Guerrero Negro. In English, it's Black Warrior. The largest salt mine in the world is located in Black Warrior, and there's a lagoon there. It's very, very famous region. And my step-great-grandfather, Juan Pons, immigrated from France and owned the Hotel Central, located in Cananea, Sonora, Mexico, that's south of Arizona, and owned the first and only gas station in Nogales, Sonora for many years. In later years, my step-great-uncles owned and managed the Pemex gas station. Subsequently, my great-grandmother owned the Hotel Central in Cananea, Sonora. My great-aunt and great-uncle managed Hotel Central for 25 years and sold it for 75,000 pesos in the early 1900s. Mexico has a remarkable, amazing, and talented number of Jewish persons. My selection for this presentation is a glimpse of the positive and life-changing influences of Mexican Jews within Mexico and globally, we were sort of originated, and our start was in Mexico, but the influences have gone beyond the borders of Mexico. And I thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I certainly could write a term paper on the little I've spoken about, but I just tried to select what I felt for a first presentation would be of interest.
Haidee, thank you very much for your presentation and overview of the arrival of Jews in Mexico and their influence over several centuries. Before I get to the Q&A and chat, just adding a personal note, my family and I lived in Mexico City in the mid-1990s. We were assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, and we belonged to the only, not at that time, the only non-Orthodox Jewish synagogue in Mexico City. And both our children, Sarah and Ben, were bat and bar mitzvahed, respectively, in that community. And we also belonged to the Israel Deportiva, the country club. And you're absolutely right, a phenomenal swimming pool and a kosher cafe to which we went on many Sundays. So I just wanted to add that personal experience. In the chat, I think this doesn't come from Phil Goldstone, no disrespect, Phil, but maybe Gordon Bromitsky, in that you are organizing a music program in Latin America and in Buenos Aires, and very much would like to talk to you, Haidee, about that. I think that comes from Gordon, but I may be mistaken. But I'll track that down for you, Haidee, so I can put the two of you together. One of the questions, I'm sorry, please, go ahead, Haidee.
Oh, yes, please give him my email and my phone number.
I'd be happy to. One question for you, and that is, what about the Jews of Juarez across from El Paso, Texas? Can you comment on that?
Well, I don't know a whole lot specifically about Jews from Juarez, but along the entire border from California to the Gulf of Mexico, on both sides of the border, there are Jewish families that are longtime families and that most own businesses, and also the younger generation have new professions, and that is very common throughout the whole entire border. And that is every border port of entry has a Jewish presence.
I'm going to ask Ron Hart if he can comment a little bit more on the Jewish community in Juarez, because you were involved in the filming of A Long Journey. And Rabbi Stephen Leon from El Paso has done a lot of work in Juarez. So Ron, could you comment on that just a moment?
Yes, thank you, Linda. In fact, I see my voice coming through. Yeah. In fact, there is an interesting community of returnees, people who come from converso backgrounds, returning to the practice of Judaism. And they worked very closely with Rabbi Leon. There's a significant community there. They have weekly Torah study classes. And one of the interesting things, some of the people in Juarez are actually members of the B'nai Zion congregation in the conservative congregation in El Paso. And, for them to come to morning services, they have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go through the line to get into the United States, even though they have the cards to come in, to be able to be there for 10 o'clock services. And as I've heard them tell their story, I've always been amazed that they're willing to go through that kind of difficulty to be able to attend morning services. And so one of the interesting things also in El Paso, because Juarez and El Paso are really, the communities are so intertwined. Some of the people in B'nai Zion have perfectly mastered Hebrew and actually lead services in B'nai Zion who are coming out of this returnee population. No. And so, yeah, there is a significant group. I don't know the exact number. The contact I've had, what I've seen, it's a group of 50 or more people who are in the return process and are active in the Jewish identity movement coming from Juarez.
Thank you, Ron. Liz Levine wrote in the chat that her Tijuana Jewish relatives moved there from Mexico City, and now they live in the US, mostly in Las Vegas, Nevada. Phil Pickman writes in the chat box, El Regalo Económico was a small variety store in Tijuana in the 1960s, and prior to that owned by Lázaro Berger. His son Isaac, Jaime, and Solo Bergo. I visited there with Isaac in September 1961. I think those of you who are familiar with New Mexico Jewish history, and Haidee, this goes back to the early part of your presentation about some of the early members of the Spanish arrivals in Mexico, eventually winding their way up into New Mexico, who came from a converso background. And we have a very rich history of crypto Jews here in New Mexico. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Haidee?
Well, what we have on the southern border, like I mentioned previously, from California to the Gulf of Mexico, is that that you will find Jewish families that I just almost have been able to actually gain all the benefits of both sides of the border. So if it's a good idea to do this on this side of the border, then we go to this side. If it's a good idea or we enjoy something in Mexico, is the other side. Almost kind of an interchangeable, bicultural, multicultural type of living. I would like to add that Ronnie grew up in Nogales, and Ronnie I'm sure you're familiar with her, Ronnie Capon Rivera Ashford. She is a longtime Nogales person. She grew up in Nogales. She's an author of children's books and of the longtime Jewish family, the Capon family, Nogales, Arizona. She has a new book out, and I will send you, Linda, the email on it, where she will have a book signing event in Tucson and in Phoenix in November. And And so it's just an awesome children's books writer.
Thank you. There's a question here, Haidee, if you can address this. Have the drug cartels affected the Jewish population in Mexico to the best of your knowledge or otherwise?
No, they haven't. There is a certain respect. It's like there's and a certain sort of fear, because like there's been incidents where certain crimes and that happened on the US side of the border against a Jewish person, how the Jewish community advocated to bring justice in representing the victim. I mean, where no one had ever ventured to do that. So the drug cartels are very selective of who they decide, because of who they're going to target, and there's a tremendous amount of fear of not knowing what could happen and also there's a tremendous amount of respect for Jewish persons in Mexico from all walks of life, of all levels of economic, social. There is the word of respect, and also, like I said, not knowing if you in any way harm that community, a person in that community, or the community, or a business, what the retaliation could be.
Okay, thank you. Ron Hart writes in the chat box, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, but Isaac Artenstein, who lives in the San Diego area, produced a film maybe 10 or so years ago called Tijuana Jews, which is a wonderful film and very informative. He also, along with Paula Schwartz and others from New Mexico, produced this film, A Long Journey, that I referred to and was featured at our annual conference last year. Lance Bell asks, Haidee, do you know much about Jewish cemeteries in Mexico? Can you comment on that?
No, I don't know very much about Jewish cemeteries, and I don't really have any comments on that.
Okay. There's a comment in the chat box. There is a new synagogue with a Moroccan rite that has just opened in Mexico City, with the presence of the Israeli ambassador and Moroccan ambassador, who's obviously Muslim, that made international news. I personally am not familiar with that. Haidee, do you have any further information about that?
No, I don't have any information about that, but I do have information about a Mexican person that became converted to Judaism and has a new synagogue in Tijuana, and that has a significant membership. But in Mexico, the Middle Eastern community, like Syrians, Iraqis, Iranians, are very friendly with the Jewish community. There's a certain camaraderie there. And Lebanon distinguishes it as a distinguished country in the Middle East, that it was the only country that was not an Arab country, even though Arabs came to live in Lebanon, and that has changed. But if you were Lebanese, you were either a Christian or you were a Jewish person. You were not an Arab.
Okay. Here's a question for you, Haidee. Even though you weren't able to provide some of the photographs, et cetera, of the synagogue doors that you had originally hoped to be able to share with us today, are there some general things you can share with us at this point about the artwork of those doors?
Yes. What's most impressive is the variety of type of doors of synagogues. Like there will be a tiny little door that's almost like a secret entrance to a synagogue in a little alleyway, and there's just a little sign that, oh, this is a synagogue, where there's some doors that are just so elaborate. They're just like beautiful works of art. And and throughout Mexico, it is a very impressive exhibit. And I am just really sorry that when I had the opportunity years ago and to view that exhibit, I didn't wire down at that moment to have access to the exhibit. But I'm hopeful that I will be able to do that. But it's the variety. I'm just and colorful doors, beautiful blues, and little doors, big doors, all types. I mean, it's almost, that's why the exhibit is so beautiful. It's every kind of imaginable door, and in the most unlikely places in Mexico.
All right. Okay. I think I have covered the comments and the questions. If I have missed someone, I apologize, but do join us in the breakout session for further conversation. I'm just going to add one more personal note in terms of Haidee, the conversos, and Ron and others were familiar with the story of Jews rediscovering their ancestry from many centuries ago. Going back to the congregation that we belong to in Mexico City, Rabbi Samuel Lehrer was our rabbi at the time. This was basically conservative congregation, certainly not Reform. But even before Rabbi Stephen Leon in El Paso, Rabbi Lehrer was traveling throughout Mexico to Monterrey, some along the border areas, Veracruz, and other Jewish communities, and converting those who were interested in becoming Jews at that time in the late 80s through the 90s. And he came under, not surprisingly, a lot of criticism from the Orthodox communities in Mexico, who challenged the veracity, if you will, of some of the claims of these individuals and families. But Samuel Lehrer was truly a pioneer in Mexico. And I had the chance to meet Rabbi Leon a couple of years ago, and I asked him if he knew Samuel Lehrer, and he said yes. He said he really worked with me in the work that I was doing along the border in those communities. So that was an interesting thing. And we'll have a little bit of wrap up. I'll start out and then turn it over to Sheldon before we leave the webinar format to go into the Zoom for those of you who'd like to join us for about a half hour. So let me just conclude with a few remarks. The saying goes, it takes a village. And that is ever so true in many ways, but that couldn't be more accurate in the planning and implementation of this year's fall conference in collaboration with the Texas Jewish Historical Society It's been an honor and a privilege, and even at times fun over the last 6 to 12 months in working together through Zoom conversations. And as I mentioned at the beginning yesterday, we had hoped to be able to have this conference in person last year in Las Cruces, and again this year in Las Cruces, but that just wasn't to be. And so we were able to pull this off with the help and support and enthusiasm of so many people whom you've met today and some of whom you haven't met. And I think one of the many things we've learned is the importance of the Galveston movement, which took place over a relatively short period of time, 7 years approximately, and the tremendous impact that it had not only on US history, but American Jewish history and the communities that those people moved to or drifted to, as the case may be, over time. We also learned more about the extended families of the descendants of the Galveston movement, early arrivals from yesterday. We learned more about Southern New Mexico and the Klein family, and today with Naomi's presentation on the Meyers family, part of her family background, that lived in Albuquerque and Amarillo. And of course, Haidee, with your presentation today about the impact of Jews in Mexican history throughout 400 years of time. So on behalf of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, we hope that you've enjoyed this year's fall conference, and we thank you for joining us. And with a little luck, we hope to be able to have in-person programs and perhaps even a fall conference. And I'll make a pitch for both us and from Texas on behalf of Texas Jewish Historical Society. If you're not a member of either one organization or even both, please do consider becoming a member. It's your membership that helps us to be able to continue to do a lot of the programs and research projects that we've been engaged in for a long, long time. So we thank you for that. And Sheldon, let me turn it over to you, please.
Thanks, Linda. I didn't prepare any remarks, but I have to say my only regret is that I didn't get to go to Las Cruces for this meeting, because I had planning a long time ago, and many other Texas members were planning on driving to Las Cruces for this meeting. So I think we would have been well represented in person, and hopefully we'll do so in future meetings. I think I've gained so much information today that I wasn't fully aware of, and so it's been a great learning experience for me. I also say, as a newish president of Texas Jewish Historical Society, talking on a one-to-one with Linda, I've learned a lot about the administration of our two organizations, and I think we still have a lot that we can share in improving how we operate, and I can see that as an ongoing relationship. But I think this is a great opportunity for two strong state organizations to share, and there are a lot of historical associations around the country, and I think we have a lot to gain by tapping into what each other has to offer. So thank you again, Linda, and everyone in New Mexico, and to everyone on Texas Jewish Historical Societies who helped pull this together.
And let me just finally say, before we conclude, There have been so many comments, including those that just came through in the chat box, to congratulate all of our speakers from both yesterday and today for the quality of your presentation and your willingness to share a tremendous wealth of knowledge about both our states and the area and families that made a major impact on small towns to larger town communities. Thank you, and hope to see you in the breakout room conversation. Thank you very much.
What's a nice Jewish girl doing in a place like this? My life was quite different than that so-called average Jewish child.
And by request, the TJHS Speakers Bureau presents stories about unknown Jews, well-known Jews, and more, either in person or by Zoom.
So perhaps I do have a story to tell, if for no other reason than it's part of the Jewish history of Santa Fe.